if you guys have questions or want me to go over something, feel free to let me know. So once you have After Effects open, the first thing you're going to see, if it's the first time you've opened it, you're going to see this little thing that's trying to make you do a tutorial. You can just skip that, or if you want to do the tutorials, that's fine. But this is what you should normally see when you open the program. It looks a lot like Photoshop, so you're going to be somewhat familiar with the interface already. And so you can basically just create a new project. You can open a project, or you can make a new file. You have a few different options here. I'm going to click New Project, and it's going to bring me to kind of the default workspace. And just like Photoshop, I can rearrange the workspace. This is kind of the default here, but I can like change the size of different things. I can like remove these panels if I want to just focus on one thing. And then if I want to, I can always go back to the window and reset whatever the default workspace is. And you can see under Window, there's a few different types of workspaces. So depending on what you're working on, if you're doing some like motion tracking or you're doing some stuff like that, you can find a specific workspace. For what we're doing, the default workspace is going to be fine. One thing with After Effects is that a lot of the components are kind of small. Like you can see all these like little icons down here. So sometimes when you're first working on it, it can be hard. It can be kind of hard to remember where certain buttons were, things like that. Feel free to kind of ask me if you ever have questions about how I did something or where to find something. But in our main default window, we're going to have the project window over here. This is going to show us like all of our footage and clips that we can add into our timeline. Then this big window in the middle is the composition window. This is where you're going to see what you've actually created, and you can manipulate it and move stuff around and add new objects and do different things. Over here is the properties window, and then there's a bunch of other little windows down here. But this info window is going to tell you some basic stuff, and then when we use certain tools, other windows will open up. Like if I'm using the text tool, I might want to look at the paragraph or the character, and so there's different kind of property windows over here. Down here is our main timeline, this window down here, and that's where we're going to do most of the animating once we've created the composition. And we can also see here, this section here is sort of like our layers in Photoshop. So our layers and our timeline are right next to each other, and that's kind of where we're going to be spending most of our time working. So those are our main components of our interface. There's also a toolbar up here, and once we create a composition, we'll be able to use some of these tools to create different types of content and move stuff around. I'm not going to go over every single individual tool, but I'll go over different ones kind of as we use them. But they're very similar to what you've already used in Illustrator and Photoshop to some extent. So there's some differences, but if something looks like a pen, it probably acts mainly like the pen from Illustrator. So right now we don't have any like footage. We don't have anything that we're working with. And so a couple ways that we can get started is we can make a new composition, or we can make a composition from footage. So if you were editing a film and you had some video files and that's what you were working with, you would start with that. We obviously don't have that, so we're just going to start with new composition, and we're going to create the content in here. When I click new composition, it's going to give me this composition settings window. And you can go back and change this later, but it's a good idea to try to get this done right the first time, because it's going to kind of affect what we're working on. And if you do a bunch of stuff and then realize it's not set up the way you want it and you have to go back later, that's going to make it kind of challenging. It's pretty easy to work with this. The defaults are probably fine. You could probably just take the defaults and go with it. But if you drop down this drop down here, there's all these different presets. And so you might choose a preset that kind of goes with what your ultimate project goal is. So these presets are all for like different TV standards. NTSC and PAL are old television broadcast standards. Down here, we see stuff that's more recent. So HD video and HD TV are kind of like internet standards. I would probably usually use something like this HD 720 or 1080 25. But what I actually usually like to use for the frame rate, this weird number 29.97 is kind of like a holdover from how traditional film and TV used to work. For animation, I usually like to set this at 24. We really don't need more than 24 frames per second to create a good animation. Most animations that you see on TV or on the internet are going to be 24 frames per second. So it doesn't really matter, but that's usually what I'm going to go for. Width is 1080, the 1080p standard. That's perfectly fine. You can just leave that as is. 1920 by 1080 is kind of the HD standard for like YouTube and stuff like that. Of course, like 4K is becoming more popular now, but we don't really need to worry about that. And then down here, the one thing that we're going to change is this duration. So instead of 30 seconds, we're just going to be making a 10-second animation. So I'm going to go down here and change that number 30 to 10. I hit enter. I didn't really mean to do that, but if we go to composition settings, we can just keep looking at it for a second. So this time code here goes by hours, minutes, seconds, and then frames. So the 0 at the beginning is 0 hours. The 00 here is 0 minutes. This 10 here is 10 seconds. And then the 00 here is how many frames. So if we do 24 frames per second, that 00 will go up to 24. Obviously, if you have a different number of frames per second, that value will change. Finally, we have a background color. I'm just going to leave this as black, but you can change the background color if you want to. And that all looks fine. So I'm going to hit OK here. And so when we create that composition, now we're going to see our timeline has some new stuff on it. Our tools up here suddenly have stuff on them. And our layers here has, we can see those buttons are highlighted now. But we don't actually have a layer. So when we create stuff, it's going to create a layer for us. And the layer kind of works like Photoshop, but it has some different properties because we're working with time, whereas Photoshop is just working with one image. So I'm going to do something really, really simple for this basic intro, which is I'm going to add a background color, and I'm going to fade it in and then fade it out. So this will let us go over layers, and it's also going to let us go over the main thing that we have to learn in this section, which is keyframing. Keyframing is like the most important sort of like lesson that we're doing as part of this animation unit. And keyframing is a little bit similar to what we did with audio when we did the fade in and fade out, that audio, what's called automation. It's a similar idea. We're basically taking a number and we're using the computer to animate that number from one value to another over time. So let's do that and see how we can do it in After Effects. So to get started, I have my composition here. You can see it's called Comp 1. And when I open it up, it takes me down here. And so this composition is where I can add different visuals, layers, and different stuff to my animation. So if I go here and I go to Layer and go to New, it's going to give me a bunch of different options for different things I can add. So I can add some text. I can add a solid. This is just like a solid color. I can add an adjustment layer. That's to do some effects. And there's a few other options I have here. We're not going to go over a lot of this stuff like lighting and camera and all this other stuff. We're just going to go over some basics. For now, I'm just going to add a solid. So I'll click solid here, and it's going to ask me to set the settings here and set a color. So let's say I'm doing one of my emotions. I'll do maybe a blue color. Maybe I'll do something about being sad, and maybe blue will go along with that. So I'll choose a blue color like that and click OK. And then I'm just going to click OK. And there we see we have our first layer. And so the layer is represented on this side with a bunch of different buttons and properties. So this is the layer area. And then over here, we see our timeline. So this bar, which is like this little red bar, it shows us how much time we're going to see this layer for. So I'm going to double click on here. Oh, whoops, that's not what I want to do. I want to rename this layer. So maybe I have to right click. So I'm going to click rename here, and I'm going to call this background. Okay, so if I click on the layer, or if I right click or context click on the layer and go to rename, I can change that layer name. And so that's a good thing to do just to keep things nice and organized. Once I create that, notice that it adds something into my project area. There's this solids thing, and it created this medium solid for me. So as I add stuff in there, it's going to put that in my project folder, and it's going to organize it for me. I may want to move stuff around and put stuff in different places, but for now, I don't have that much going on. I'm just going to kind of let it do whatever it wants. So now I have my background image. So I'm going to show a couple things with the timeline, and then we're going to add in our first animation. So I mentioned this red bar represents this, this blue color, and I can change the length of this bar. So if I move the beginning, I can change the duration, and I can move the end as well. So when I mouse over the edges on the right and left, the mouse turns into this like little two-way arrow, and that lets me start and stop this thing. And so then once I do that, I can also move the bar around in time. So once I move the bar over here, now at the beginning of the animation we don't see it, but it comes in later. So if I move the playhead, so this blue triangle connected to that blue line is called the playhead. And as I'm creating the animation, I'm going to move the playhead around to add different parts to my animation. So now I can see the blue doesn't come in until here at 1 second, and then it goes out around here. Okay, so we can change where in our 10 seconds this appears. And if I play this back, if I hit the space bar, you'll see the blue appears while where that red layer is, and then it disappears. So a couple more things with the timeline. There's these two blue, or they're really gray, but there's two bars that have blue edges. And these don't affect the animation, but they affect what I see in the timeline. So this one on the top, if I drag this back, it changes the zoom of the animation, but it doesn't actually change the length of the animation itself. So if I zoom all the way in and I play back the animation, it still plays through the whole animation. This just moves what I see in the timeline. So that makes it easier to zoom in or zoom out to make edits to my animation. This blue bar does change what I see in the animation, but only in the preview. So let's say I really wanted to like work on this one part of the animation and get this like this transition from black to blue perfect. I can set this part of my animation, and then actually I need to set loop. Where's the loop button? There should be a loop button here. Let's see if I can find loop. Oh, that's weird. Okay. Okay. I guess there's no loop button. Anyway, what should happen when I set this second one is that that changes the preview. So again, if I export the animation, it's going to export the whole thing. But if I'm working on one specific part of the animation and I don't want it to play through the whole thing, I can change this bar down here. So you might not really need to use those that much, but if you're working on a longer animation, you would want to move around to different parts of the animation and focus on them while you're working. Okay, so let's make this blue background take up the whole animation again, and then we're going to add a very simple animation to the background. A couple more things real quick. Looking at the composition window, you can see this drop down here is the zoom of the composition window. So if I fit, that's usually what I want to fit the whole thing in. But I could also zoom in. So if I go to 100, that's going to show me what it will really look like when I export. I can also zoom way out. If I go to like 25%, I can see this whole thing. But most of the time I'll say fit. This button here, or this drop down, is the quality of the animation. So usually I'll set this to like a half or a third, because if when After Effects is like actually calculating all the properties, that takes up some time, so it won't play back as fast. So usually I'll set this to half or third, so that way the playback will be okay. And this green bar that you see here basically says that this part of the animation has been rendered. So if I move this around, actually there's not that much happening, but you can see as I move this, the green bar is like going away and then coming back. As we add more stuff, this will take longer because After Effects is doing the calculations for the animation. Okay, let's actually add in a new component. So when I click on this layer, there's a little triangle right here that if I open this up, it shows me all the properties of this layer. Okay, so this is how we can animate different properties. So you can see the properties of the layer. There's an anchor point, that's like the center of the layer. There's a position, that's where the layer is, in the screen, like I can move it around, although I don't want to do that. There's the scale, so I can scale this color in and out. And there's rotation, so I can also rotate this. If I choose the rotate tool, it'll let me rotate it around. There is opacity, and opacity is actually the first thing that we're going to animate. This is how transparent something is. So if I turn this down to 0, it's completely transparent, so we see through to the black background. If I turn it up to 100, now it's completely opaque, so we see the full blue color. So all of these different properties are things that we can animate. They're just numbers that we can move from one place to another. And so doing that is, to do that, we use what's called keyframes. So let's start with opacity. Another thing that as you get more comfortable with After Effects is there's a lot of keyboard shortcuts. So you can see there's a lot of different properties, and if I want to go directly to those properties instead of having to click to open these things, I can use the keyboard shortcuts. So for example, T is for opacity. I think it's because it's also like transparency. I'm not sure why it's not O, but it's T. Then P will give me position. S will give me scale. What are the other ones? Maybe A will give me anchor point. Yeah, A for anchor point, and then probably R for rotation. So usually that's what I'll use if I'm working on something because it does it much faster. And I can do T to get opacity, and then I hit T again, and it goes away. So I'm going to hit T to get the opacity. And then if I set the opacity down to 0, now that blue color is just not there because it's completely transparent. So what I want to do is I want to fade the blue color in over time. And to do that, I use keyframes. So this little stopwatch next to opacity lets me create a keyframe. And when I click that keyframe, it's going to look at the value here and the time, and it's going to save that in the memory of the animation. So if I click this keyframe here, you'll see there's a little diamond shape right there. And so it saves that 0 there. Now if I move my playhead to 1 second, and I change the opacity, I'm going to increase it to 100%. Notice it already created the keyframe for me. I didn't have to add the other keyframe. After Effects is designed to be efficient. So if it sees that if I have a keyframe already and I go somewhere else and I change the value, it's going to assume that what I want is to add a new keyframe. If I decide I don't want it to be there, I can click that keyframe and I can move it somewhere else, or I can just delete it. And then if I decide I want it again, here's the tricky part. This is the thing that confuses most people when they first start using After Effects. You would think, okay, I want to add a keyframe here. You would think, okay, I just click the stopwatch again. But that's not what you do. If I click the stopwatch again, it takes all the keyframes away. The stopwatch is basically saying I want to have keyframes, but it's not for adding a new keyframe. So I'm going to undo that. To add a new keyframe, I click this button here. That looks like a keyframe. So that's kind of the tricky thing that a lot of people get confused when they first start using After Effects. Okay, so we've got our first keyframe. And so I have to actually do this over because I undid it. Okay, so now if I hit play, we get that nice fade in. If I want that to be longer, again, I can move this to 2 seconds. and now we can see that fade in over time. So these two keyframes basically just set the beginning and end point of this transition in the opacity. I can move this keyframe up here if I want to wait a second and then have the fade in happen. And I can also make more keyframes. So if I wanted to go here and like ramp it up a little bit early or make it go down a little bit, now we'll see what happens is I get a little bit of fade in and then a quick fade in at the end. So I can add as many keyframes as I want to, but most of the time I'm happy to let the computer kind of figure out the values in between these two frames. Okay, so let's say I want to have a fade out at the end. You might say, okay, I'm going to go all the way to the end. I'm going to take my opacity and go down to 0. So now what we're going to have is a very, very long fade out because the value is going to stay here, and then this keyframe down here, the computer is going to be changing those values for that entire duration. That's not what I want. I want a short fade out at the end. So what I can do is I can either go to where I want the fade out to start and change the value here. Okay, so now it's going to stay that color until we hit here, and then it fades out. Or if I want to just copy and paste, I can select this keyframe and hit Command C, and then wherever my playhead is, when I hit Command V, it's going to paste in that new keyframe. So let's move this to the end. Okay, so I'm going to wrap up. So we've covered a couple things. This should be enough to get started. We are going to have our break in a second, so we probably will just keep doing some more stuff in a second. But so we've got our fade in and fade out. And so let's quickly just add another layer, although I hit Command S, and so now I should save this. So let's go over that real quick. So I want to save this project. I'm going to go to my desktop, go to MMP 100, make a new folder. This is animated text or words and emotion. And I'm just going to call this my animation.aep and save that. Okay, so let's say I want to add another layer. One thing I might do is lock this layer so that if I'm changing my other layer, I don't accidentally click the background. Let's say I want to animate in a shape. I can go up to my tools up here, and let's get a let's do a polygon. I can create a polygon, and then this works very much the same way as Illustrator. I can move this around. I can change the fill. Let's say we have like a light green. I can change the stroke. I could have like a white stroke, and I could increase the size of the stroke. With my polygon, I can rotate it. I can size it. I can do all sorts of different stuff. I should be able to change the number of points in the polygon. I forget exactly where that is, but we'll find that in a second. So when I add this in here, I'm actually going to turn the stroke off. I don't really think we need it. Okay, so once I have this polygon, I can continue to animate any of these properties. So we can look at the properties in this polygon. So if I open this up, there's actually a couple different things. One is the transform, and that has our basic properties that we already looked at. The anchor point, position, scale, rotation, opacity. Most of the times, those things will kind of get us where we need to go. But shapes have their own special contents. And so text also has this. So we can see there's this thing called the polystar, and there's some different effects in here. There's a polystar path, so there's points in here. So there's actually a lot of different properties. We can also animate the stroke and the fill. We can animate all of this stuff separately. So there's a lot of properties. You can kind of like very quickly get bogged down and confused if you're looking through all this stuff. So I'd recommend starting simple at first, but these things can be useful if you have like specific goals that you're going for. But I'm just going to do a really simple rotation. just as my last example before we take a break. So I'm going to go here. Here's rotation. So if I want to focus on that, I can just hit R. I can hit the stopwatch to create a keyframe. And now if I go ahead a little bit, if I want to rotate this, I can either just change the property right here, and I can rotate as much as I want, or I can use the rotate tool and rotate here, and you can see it's actually updating the property there as well. And you can see that it's rotating 6 times, 7 times, 8 times. So it's not just rotating once and then starting over. As I rotate around, it's actually increasing here. So now we can see this is going to rotate like way too many times. Although it's kind of funny. And then another thing with the rotation that's important to notice is that the anchor point here is where it's going to rotate from. So if I want to move that, I can. I use this anchor point tool. And if I move the anchor point over here, now it's rotating over there. So if I move the anchor point back, so we can change that point of rotation a little bit. Okay, so it's 2:40. We need to take a break. We've gone over some basic things here. So let's take a break for a bit. I'll go over some tech stuff in a minute. But for now, we can just take our normal break if you want to use the bathroom or get coffee or whatever. We'll come back at 3, and we'll talk about a couple more things and then keep working with After Effects.